"I have been to hell," she whispered, her voice cutting through the clinking of champagne glasses like a serrated blade. When Audrey Hepburn walked into her final public galas, the room didn't just go silent, it turned ice cold. This wasn't the chic icon from the movie posters. This was a woman who looked like she had been carved out of pure exhaustion and grief. The truth is, the Hollywood elite were absolutely terrified of her during those last months. They wanted the girl in the little black dress, but she gave them a nightmare they couldn't look away from. My perspective is simple. Audrey Hepburn wasn't a fragile flower. She was a ruthless tactical genius who used her dying body as a weapon to shame the world's elite into action. It was a masterpiece of PR manipulation fueled by raw, unfiltered rage. If you've ever felt like you're wearing a mask just to survive while your internal world is screaming for something real, you belong here. Subscribe. The first layer of the lie was the peaceful retirement. The world believed she was living a quiet life in a Swiss villa, sipping tea and enjoying her gardens. That was a total fabrication. While the tabloids printed photos of her looking regal, Audrey was actually dragging herself through war zones in Somalia, stepping over corpses in the mud while her own body was being eaten alive by cancer. She knew. She felt the agony every time she moved. But she hid the diagnosis from the cameras with the same precision she used to hit her marks on a film set. She realized that the moment the headlines became about her health, the children would become invisible again. Subscribe as a commitment to unbrainwashing yourself from the sanitized versions of history. Look at the archival footage of her final appearances. The shock on the faces of the celebrities around her is visceral. They are physically recoiling. When she took the stage, she didn't talk about the joy of giving. She spoke about the literal smell of death. She described the flies on the eyes of infants while people in the front row, wearing millions in jewelry, shifted in their seats and avoided eye contact. It was the most awkward, tense atmosphere in the history of show business. She was breaking the unspoken rule of celebrity. Never make the audience feel truly guilty. Read between the lines of her final speeches, and you'll realize she wasn't just asking for donations. She was indicting everyone in that room. The makeup artists on her last trips struggled to hide the gray tint of her skin, yet she insisted on more cameras. It was a suicide mission disguised as a charity tour. But the biggest secret wasn't her illness. It was what she found in the dirt of those villages that made her realize Hollywood was the real desert. You, sitting there scrolling, probably think you know the face of Grace. You see the Givenchy dresses and the long cigarette holders, and you think, class. But you've been sold a brand, not a person. The real Audrey Hepburn was a woman who had seen people eat tulip bulbs to survive during the war, and by 1992, she was done pretending that Hollywood mattered. The third layer of the lie is the most uncomfortable. She wasn't just charitable. She was disgusted. Look at the footage of her in the back of a bouncing military jeep in Baidoa. The dust is caked into the wrinkles around her eyes. She isn't wearing a stitch of makeup. Her hair is greasy, pulled back into a messy knot. This was the woman who once defined elegance, now standing in the middle of a literal city of death. She was surrounded by thousands of bodies, and while the cameras were rolling, she did something the PR teams hated. She touched the dying. She didn't use gloves. She didn't pull back. She sat in the dirt, the same dirt that was contaminated and filthy, and she held children who were exhaling their final breaths. But the producers back in New York and London were terrified. They wanted the breakfast at Tiffany's Audrey to sell the story. They wanted her to look sad but pretty. Instead, she looked haunted. She looked like she belonged in the trenches because, in her mind, she did. She once told a close friend that the smell of decomposing flesh in Somalia reminded her of her childhood in the Netherlands. Think about that. While the world saw a fashion icon, she was experiencing a PTSD flashback that lasted 4 years. And here is the part the biographies usually skip over because it ruins the fairy tale. The physical pain was becoming a monster. During that final mission, she was experiencing stabbing pains in her abdomen that would make a grown man scream. She would double over in the privacy of her tent, sweating through her clothes, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. But the moment a photographer appeared, she stood up. She straightened her spine. She wiped the sweat away and walked into the sun. It was a performance more grueling than anything she ever did for Paramount. It was pure theater designed to keep the world's eyes on the hunger, not on her dying cells. Now, look closer at her return to the United States. In late 1992, she attended a gala where she was supposed to be the guest of honor. The room was filled with the elite, caviar on silver platters, the air thick with the smell of $500 perfume. Audrey stood at the podium, and you can see it in her eyes, a cold, sharp detachment. She looked at these people, her peers, and she saw ghosts. She saw people who spent more on a pair of shoes than it cost to feed an entire village for a month. She didn't give a thank you speech. She gave a deposition. She described the sound of dry skin rubbing together. She described the silence of a camp where no children are crying because they are too weak to make a sound. The room went dead silent. The clinking of forks stopped. It was the most awkward 3 minutes in the history of that ballroom. She wasn't inspiring them, she was judging them, and they hated it. Behind the polite applause, the whispers started. They said she had lost her mind. They said she was too intense. They wanted the doll, and she gave them the corpse. Subscribe right now if you're tired of the sanitized plastic versions of history they feed you on TV. The final lie, the one at the very center of the doll, was the reason she kept going. It wasn't about saving the world. That's the line the media sold. The truth is much darker. Audrey Hepburn was running away from Hollywood. She hated the vanity. She hated the fake smiles. She realized that the glamour of her youth was a cage. She chose the war zones because in the middle of the horror, people were real. There were no agents there, no scripts, no lighting directors, just the raw, brutal reality of life and death. When she finally went into surgery in Los Angeles in November 1992, the doctors opened her up and were horrified. The cancer wasn't just there. It had wrapped itself around her entire system like a vine. It was a silent cancer that had been screaming for months, and she had simply ignored it to finish her work. The surgeons knew immediately it was over, but even then the PR machine tried to spin it. They released statements saying she was recovering. But watch the paparazzi footage of her leaving the hospital for the last time. She is wrapped in a heavy coat, even though it's a warm day. She is being shielded by her partner, Robert Wolders. Her face is gaunt, her eyes sunken into her skull. She knew she was going home to Switzerland to die. She didn't want a hospital bed. She wanted the garden. She wanted the silence. The industry tried to turn her funeral into a televised circus. They wanted the red carpet treatment for her casket, but her family fought back. They kept it private. They kept it simple. Because in the end, Audrey Hepburn's greatest act of rebellion wasn't a movie role. It was the fact that she stripped off the diamonds, walked into the mud, and stayed there until her body literally gave out. She proved that the most famous woman in the world would rather spend her last days in a famine-stricken desert than spend one more minute under the fake lights of a studio. Read between the lines. Her life wasn't a romance. It was a protest. And the world is still trying to pretend it was just a movie. Look at the dirt, not the dress. That's where the truth is buried. The tension in the room at the 1993 Academy Awards was thick enough to cut with a knife. This was supposed to be the night they honored her with the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award. The biggest names in Hollywood were sitting in those velvet seats, draped in millions of dollars of borrowed diamonds, waiting to clap for a ghost. Gregory Peck stood on that stage, his voice cracking, trying to maintain the illusion of Tinseltown royalty. But the audience wasn't just sad. They were uncomfortable. They were looking at the screen, seeing clips of Audrey in the mud of Somalia, and then looking at their own manicured hands.
Pictures. Thank you.
It was a great gig for us. Thanks, Audrey.
Before Dad Donald's second trip to the White House.
You want to have drums?
Audrey, they were crying because her real life made their entire existence look like a cheap plastic toy. Let's unwrap the layers of the lie the studios have fed you for decades. The first layer of the Matryoshka doll is the graceful icon. You see the black dress, the long cigarette holder, and the perfect smile. That was a product. It was manufactured by lighting directors and seamstresses. Peel that away, and you find the second layer, the saintly volunteer. The media loved this version. It made for great headlines. But even that was a mask. The real Audrey wasn't doing charity work to be good. She was doing it because she was haunted. She was a woman who had seen people eat tulip bulbs to survive the war. She wasn't giving back. She was trying to outrun the memories of her own starvation. Now, look at the final smallest doll at the center. This is the truth the industry buried. Audrey Hepburn ended up hating the very image that made her rich. Every time she had to put on those pearls for a photo op, she felt like she was putting on a noose. The crowd at the Oscars didn't want to hear that. They wanted to believe she loved being a star. They wanted to believe the glamour was enough for her. But the reality was written in the physical wreckage of her body. She had spent her final years sleeping on dirt floors and flying in cramped, shaking planes into active war zones. She wasn't aging gracefully. She was being physically consumed by the stress of seeing the world's most vulnerable people die while she was expected to talk about her favorite lipstick shade. Look at the footage of her final public appearances. Her skin is paper-thin. Her frame is skeletal. Everyone whispered that she was just naturally thin, but the truth was her body was literally shutting down under the weight of the secrets she kept. The PR teams were working overtime to hide the fact that their golden girl was crumbling. They wanted you to focus on the silk scarves, not the IV drips. They wanted the fantasy to stay intact because a dying icon is bad for the back catalog sales. When the news of her death finally hit, the industry went into a frenzy to claim her. They tried to turn her funeral into a televised event, a final production for the masses. But her family shut the gates. They knew the truth. They knew that Hollywood was the very thing she was trying to scrub off her skin in her final hours. Only the mentally resilient made it this far into the video. You've seen past the filter and the fake lighting that most people swallow without a second thought. Hit subscribe, Survivor, because we are tearing down more of these golden statues every single week. The brutal reality is that Audrey Hepburn didn't die a Hollywood princess. She died as a woman who had spent her life trying to escape the frame of a camera. She didn't want the awards. She didn't want the applause. She wanted to be far away from the fake smiles and the scripted lines. She chose the mud over the red carpet, and it eventually cost her everything. The industry kept the iconic photos and the royalties. The cancer kept her body. And the world kept the lie. She wasn't a movie star who did some good. She was a woman who used her fame as a getaway vehicle to escape a world she couldn't stand. The dress was just a costume. The pain was the only thing that was real. Watch the footage from the 1993 Academy Awards again. Gregory Peck stands on that stage, his voice cracking, as he presents an honorary award to a woman who isn't even in the room. The camera pans across the audience, and for a split second, the Hollywood mask slips. You see the faces of the most powerful people in the world, and they aren't clapping with joy. They are frozen. There is a palpable, heavy tension in that room because the elite knew the truth the public was still being denied. They were looking at the legacy of a woman who had essentially traded her physical existence for the survival of children the world had ignored. The industry tried to wrap her fading life in a bow of grace and poise, but that was a calculated move to protect the brand. It was pure theater, designed to keep the ticket sales moving. Inside that PR lie was another one, the idea that she died peacefully in her sleep. Look at the logistics of her final days. She was in such bad shape she couldn't even fly on a commercial plane. A private jet had to be packed with flowers to mask the clinical smell of the medical equipment keeping her stable. She was a hollowed-out version of the icon everyone wanted to remember. The studio heads didn't want you to see the IV lines or the way the pain had sharpened her features into something unrecognizable. They wanted the image of the girl in the black dress to live forever, even as the real woman was being buried in a small Swiss village, miles away from the cameras she spent decades trying to avoid. Subscribe to leave your mark in this archive of human folly before the next legend is rewritten by a corporate marketing team. The brutal reality is that Audrey Hepburn paid for her fame with every single ounce of her health. Hollywood kept the timeless movie posters, the million-dollar dress auctions, and the digital